To calculate an activity rate or an overhead rate, you're going to take overhead and divide it by the appropriate activity level. Our overhead here is $160,000. And for the activity level, you have to actually choose which one to use. You can either use labor hours or you can use number of moves. And since it's moving cost, then the most common sense way to go about allocating would be based on number of moves. So that is going to give you an overhead rate or an activity rate of $2 per move. Number 2 says using only unit-based activity drivers to assign non-unit related overhead cost can cause. Basically what this problem is saying is that if you have overhead cost that is not related to producing a unit, so for example, overhead cost could be your utility bill. If you use the number of units in order to allocate that overhead, that is not always the best way to allocate the overhead. And the issue that you have is that it can give you a distorted product cost. The cost could either be too high or too low, and that can cause issues. Problem number 3 says that producing 10,000 units of a cell phone requires $300,000 of labor and material. It used 2,000 machine hours, 1,200 setups. The activity rates are $40 per machine hour and $100 per setup. What is the cost of the cell phone? So basically, they've already done a little bit of work for you as far as the prime cost goes. Now we need to figure out how much overhead that we are going to give to the cell phone. To come up with the amount of overhead cost to give to the cell phone, we have machine cost. So your rate is $40 per machine hour. The cell phone took 2,000 machine hours. Then you also have setup cost of $100 per setup, and we had 1,200 setups for the cell phone. So that gives you $80,000 of machine cost, and then $120,000 of setup. So your total overhead is $200,000. So total product cost is the $300,000 of prime plus the $200,000 of overhead. So it's $500,000 total. So to come up with a cost per unit, you've got a total of $500,000, and you produced 10,000 phones. So your cost is $50 per unit. Question number 4, as we make 2 different types of cameras. We have 2 different cameras. It gives you the overhead cost that's already broken down into the pools. So they've already done part 1. So it's asking you how much overhead are you going to allocate to the 35mm cameras. And this question actually says using a plant-wide rate. So if we use it using a plant-wide rate, we're going to base it solely on machine hours. So you want to first come up with total overhead cost. So you have 60 plus 40 plus 8 plus 24. That's going to give you your total cost divided by total number of machine hours. So that's going to give you a rate of $6.60 per machine hour. 35mm camera has 10,000, so that's going to give you a cost of $66,000. And again, this is how you would work the problem if it told you just to use a plant-wide rate. Then you allocate all of the overhead using one singular cost driver. Problem number 5 gives us different costs. Again, it's already broken into the cost pool. It gives you the cost driver, the activity driver for each different product. It says what amount of overhead cost would be allocated to the pipe cutting tool. Okay, so we are clearly just going to this one particular product. In order to allocate the overhead, the first thing that you need to calculate is your overhead rate for each cost pool. So for the unit level, your activity rate is $12.50 per direct labor hour. So your cost is $100,000. It's telling you to use 8,000 direct labor hours. So it's $12.50 per direct labor hour. For batch level, it's $12,000 of that cost divided by the 100 setups, so your rate is $120 per setup. For product level, you're just going to take a percentage of the use, which we'll see in a minute is in the problem. Then for facility level, it's $240,000. Divide that by the 48,000 units, so your overhead rate is $5 per unit. So we want to know what's the total amount of overhead cost that's allocated to the pipe cutting tool. So first off, we need to give some unit level cost to the pipe cutting tool. So to give it some unit level cost, your rate is $12.50 per direct labor hour. So you want to multiply that by how many direct labor hours we worked on the pipe cutting tool. So the problem tells you that the pipe cutting tool, we used 800 labor hours. So that's going to give you $10,000 of overhead cost. For batch level, your rate is $120 per setup, and we had 25 setups for the pipe cutting tool. So that's $3,000. For product level, it says that it's a percentage of use, and it tells you that the pipe cutting tool consumed 20% of the product sustaining cost. So that's going to give you $4,000 of product cost. And then for facility level, your rate is $5 per unit, and we produced 3,000 pipe cutting tools, so that's going to give you $15,000. So to find the total cost that goes to the total overhead that's allocated to the pipe cutting tool, you would just simply add together the 10,000 plus 3,000 plus 4,000 plus 15,000. So that should total up and give you $32,000. Question number 6 says that we allocate on the basis of direct labor hours, and it allocates overhead costs of $12,800 to the two different jobs. So basically, based on direct labor hours, each uses 10 hours. So then the overhead was obviously just be split in half. It says the production process for job 1 is now automated. So by telling you that it's automated, it means that you make it by machines. So it will not use as many labor hours. So it says now, instead of using 10 hours of labor, job 1 is only going to use 5 hours of labor, but it's going to consume more mechanical processing costs. As a result, total overhead increases to $15,000. So instead of being $12,800, now the overhead goes up to $15,000. It says how much overhead will be assigned to job 1 and 2 after automation if we continue to use direct labor hours. So if we continue to use direct labor hours, you're going to have 5 hours from job 1 plus 10 hours for job 2, so you have 15 total hours. So if the overhead goes up to $15,000 and you've got 15 direct labor hours, then your rate is $1,000 per direct labor hour. So job 1, that's now only using 5 hours, is only going to be given $5,000 of the cost. Job 2, however, that is still using 10 hours of labor, is going to then get the remaining $10,000 of overhead. So if you look at this, let's assume that getting half of the overhead is correct. Then after automation, if you continue to use direct labor hours, the job that's automated, that cuts down hours, is going to have too little overhead given to it, and the job that is not automated is going to have too much overhead. So make sure you understand that the job that is automated should have 6,400 or half of the overhead, but it doesn't. It only has 5. So it got too little. So it's been under costed. Okay, so the result is that job 1 is under costed. Job 2, however, continued to be use direct labor hours. Again, should only get, let's say, half of the overhead, so only 7,500. But we're allocating it 10 because of the way the rate was based upon. So it got too much overhead, so it's been over costed. Number 7 says how much setup cost should be assigned to the graphite shafts if activity-based costing is used. Basically, your setup cost is $62,000, and it was 436 batches. So that would be the best cost driver to use, or the best activity level to use. So that's going to give you a rate of $17.22 per batch. We are trying to allocate cost to the graphite shafts. The graphite shafts consumed 20 batches. So that's going to give you $34,444. Next problem, we make golf balls and we make baseballs. Golf ball requires 5,000 hours, 8,000 hours for baseball. Overhead cost prior to automation is 15. After automation, overhead cost jumped up to 25. We use direct labor hours as a company-wide rate before and after automation. What is the amount of overhead cost allocated to each product? So basically, we just want to calculate and just compare what the overhead would look like before automation. And then we're going to do the same thing for after. So before automation, it says that the overhead cost is $15,000. We use direct labor hours. So you have 5,000 plus 8,000. So before automation, your rate is $1.15 per direct labor hour. So for golf balls, the correct amount of overhead would be $77.50. For baseball, it would be $9,200. And this would be a good automation, or I'm sorry, this would be a good allocation before automation because they're both labor intensive. But after automation, overhead's going to jump up to 25,000. Direct labor hours are going to go down because now the baseballs are going to be automated. So their labor hours are only 2,000. So your hours are still 5 for golf, but only 2 for the baseball. So that's going to bump your rate up to $3.57 per direct labor hour. So for the golf, now because the rate has gone up, because there's fewer direct labor hours, because the baseballs were automated, now the golf balls are going to be given even more overhead cost. So it's going to go up from $77.50 to $17,850. Keep in mind, nothing changed for the golf balls. The golf balls used no more cost than before. So it's not correct or not fair that the golf balls now have to receive more of the overhead cost. That is an incorrect allocation. That's not a good allocation. The baseballs, the overhead went down from $9,200 to $7,140, even though their automation is what caused the cost to jump up. So if you think about that logically, the baseballs should be receiving more of the overhead cost, but they're not. And the reason is because we used an improper activity base or an improper cost driver. We continue to use direct labor hours. Baseballs should not be given overhead based on direct labor hours anymore. That's an incorrect way to allocate. So after automation, the golf balls are now overcosted and the baseballs are undercosted, and that can create a definite issue. That thought process is what brings you to number 9. We've got 2 different cabinets. Initially, they're both labor intensive. However, now we've automated the contemporary line. If you continue to use direct labor hours, then the contemporary line, the product that's been automated, is going to get too little overhead, and the heritage line is going to get too much overhead. If you need to look at numbers to make this problem work, then look back at number 8. The automated product gets too little overhead. The unautomated product ends up getting too much overhead if you continue to use direct labor hours after automation.